Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You know how this works? One topic, one deep dive.
That's right.
And this one comes straight from your suggestions,
Yeah,
actually.
we love hearing from all of you. Really helps us zero in on what y'all are interested in.
Yeah, so today's all about a thought experiment. And I gotta say, this one really gets the gears turning.
A classic, really. One of those that seems simple at first, but the more you dig, the more you realize how deep it goes.
Exactly.
It's Molyneux's problem we're tackling this time.
All right, so for anyone who's not familiar, let's paint the picture.
Okay, imagine this.
You got a person, blind from birth, right? They've never seen a single thing their entire life.
Right, never experienced sight.
But they're able to tell a globe and a cube apart. Just by touch, no problem.
Absolutely, through touch alone.
Now, imagine if they suddenly gain sight.
Say, through some new medical procedure.
Could they immediately recognize those same objects, the globe and the cube, just by looking at them?
Without touching them, without any prior visual experience.
Mm-hmm. That's the heart of Molyneux's problem, a question posed way back in 1688.
1688, yeah. It came from William Molyneux, an Irish scientist, fascinated by optics and how sight works.
Interesting guy.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a good chance his interest was sparked by his wife, who actually lost her vision.
Makes you think.
He posed this question in a letter to John Locke, the philosopher. Remember, Locke was wrestling with ideas about how we gain knowledge through the senses.
Right, like whether our understanding of things like space and shape comes from just one sense or from multiple senses working together.
That's it. And this whole question about the globe and the cube, it really honed in on that. Like, okay, what happens when you suddenly introduce a whole new sense into the mix?
It's like Molyneux was saying, all right, Locke, you talk about ideas from different senses, but what happens when you suddenly give someone a whole new sense? How do they make sense of it?
Exactly. It shines a light on this potential gap between knowing something by touch and knowing it by sight.
And get this, Locke was so intrigued he included the whole problem in the second edition of his famous essay concerning human understanding.
Yeah, in 1694.
Talk about amplifying the question. Suddenly, it's not just a letter between two guys anymore. It's out there for everyone to debate.
Right, and at that point, it was all theoretical.
Yeah.
Philosophers just duking it out with logic and reason, trying to understand how the heck visual and tactile sensations connect.
Yeah, like, is a cube regardless of whether you feel it or see it?
Precisely.
Okay, so let's talk about those 18th century philosophers. How did they approach this whole sensory puzzle?
Well, most started from the premise that touch and sight, they're fundamentally different. You know, feeling something is a totally different experience than seeing it.
You're getting texture, pressure, temperature.
Exactly. But then the argument started flying about how these different experiences relate, if at all.
Some real fireworks there, huh? So walk us through the main camps.
All right, well, you had Berkeley taking a radical stance. He argued that the connection between sight and touch is completely arbitrary, a product of learning.
Meaning there's no inherent reason why seeing round should connect to feeling round. We just learn that association over time.
Exactly. Like, imagine a baby seeing a ball for the first time. It's just a blob of color and light until they reach out and touch it. Then, slowly, they build that connection.
That's wild. So our senses don't inherently speak the same language. We have to learn to translate.
That was Berkeley's point, yeah.
Makes you wonder about other senses, too.
Yeah, like smell and taste.
And crazy.
On the flip side, you had thinkers like Lee and Singe. They were adamant that the connection is necessary, something we immediately grasped. They believed there's something inherent about a cube, whether you touch it or see it, that just screens cube to the mind.
Like a universal cubeness our brains are hardwired to recognize.
Right, a kind of built-in understanding, like
Yeah.
recognizing a song played on a different instrument. The melody's the same, regardless of the sound.
Ooh, I like that analogy.
And then there were Molyneux and Locke themselves, taking a middle ground. They propose a connection is necessary, but it's learned through experience.
It's not random, but it takes time to build that bridge between feeling and seeing.
Exactly.
And their debate wasn't just about the raw sensations. They also pondered how we form mental concepts, our notions, as they called them, of these objects through different senses.
Exactly. For example, Reed, he argued that our visual idea of a globe and our tactile idea are totally separate. We feel the roundness, and we see something we learn to associate with that feeling.
Two different representations in the mind that we connect through experience.
Precisely. But then you had folks like Boulier and Hutchison suggesting that visual and tactile notions are essentially the same, or at least share some fundamental element we perceive directly.
Like a core concept of shape that both senses tap into.
Right, maybe a sense of boundaries or
Yeah.
edges. And then Leibniz came in with his rationalist perspective. He figured that even if the raw sensory data differs, our reason allows us to deduce that the forms are actually the same. We can logically conclude that the round thing we see is the same as the round thing we feel.
So with all these different views on the table, how did they actually answer Molyneux's question? Could that newly sighted person tell the difference?
Well, it kind of split along philosophical lines. The empiricists, like Molyneux, Locke, and Berkeley, they generally said no. They figured without the experience to connect visual and tactile information, the person would be lost.
Makes sense, given their emphasis on learning.
Right. But the rationalists, like Singe, Lee, and Leibniz, they leaned towards yes. They thought a more innate understanding of form or the power of reason would allow the person to make the connection.
So already we see that there's not one clear-cut answer, even on a purely theoretical level.
Exactly. And it gets even more complicated when you realize they were all interpreting the scenario differently. Some imagined it as an instantaneous recognition. Others allowed for some mental processing.
Some assumed the person knew what they were about to see, others didn't.
Right. All these subtle differences really muddy the waters.
Okay, so that's the theoretical landscape. But then things get interesting in the 18th century when actual experiments enter the picture.
Yes. This is where things start to get real.
Tell me about it. Suddenly we're not just playing mind games, we're getting data.
And one of the key moments comes in 1728 with William Cheselden, a surgeon in England.
What did he do?
Well, he publishes this account of a young boy, Daniel Dollins, who had been blind from cataracts his whole life.
Oh, wow.
And Cheselden performed surgery to remove those cataracts,
Right.
giving the boy sight for the first time.
Talk about a life-changing experience.
Absolutely. And Cheselden documented what he observed as this boy encountered the world visually.
So what happened? Could he see the globe and the cube?
Well, initially the boy was completely overwhelmed. He couldn't recognize shapes or distinguish objects, even things that were vastly different.
Like he could see, but it was all just a jumble of meaningless shapes.
Exactly. It took time for him to learn to associate what he was seeing with what he already knew by touch.
Wow, that's hard to imagine. It really underscores how crucial experience is for making sense of visual information.
It does. And in this case, it gave a huge boost to the no side of Molyneux's problem, especially for philosophers who, like Berkeley, believe that vision is heavily reliant on learned associations.
Makes sense. If this boy who's had a lifetime of tactile experience still can't immediately recognize things visually, it supports the idea that there's a learning curve.
Right. It was seen as evidence that the senses don't automatically speak the same language.
But of course, no philosophical debate is ever truly settled. Were there counter-arguments to this interpretation of Cheselden's case?
Oh, absolutely. Philosophers like Lemaitre and Diderot, they raised some important questions about the details of the case.
Yeah.
Was the boy's vision actually perfect right after the surgery? Had he had enough time to recover and adjust?
And could Cheselden himself have unintentionally influenced the boy's responses? Like maybe his questions subtly steered him in a certain direction?
Exactly. They argue that the setup wasn't controlled enough to draw definitive conclusions. They even proposed ways to design better experiments, with more careful preoperative assessments, longer recovery times, and rigorous methods to avoid any leading questions.
So basically, more scientific rigor.
Exactly. They wanted to eliminate any possible biases or confounding factors.
Makes sense. And then there's the whole issue with cataracts not always causing complete blindness.
Ah, yes. Marion pointed that out. He said, hold on, most people with cataracts still have some perception of light, which is different from the complete congenital blindness Molyneux had in mind.
Right, it's a bit of a different scenario.
It is. But the counterargument was that even if there's some residual light perception, the inability to see forms before the surgery is still relevant. The key point is, can they recognize a shape visually if they've only ever experienced it through touch?
So while the 18th century brought some real-world data to the table, it didn't quite settle the debate. So what happened in the 19th century? How did things progress?
Well, in the 19th century, you see a push for more systematic controlled experiments. Ophthalmologists like Franz and Nunnally, they actually designed experiments to test form and size perception in cataract patients.
Really focusing in on those core aspects.
Exactly. And guess what they use?
Globes and cubes.
You got it. Trying to replicate Molyneux's scenario as closely as possible.
Did they get any clearer results?
Well, the findings were still a mixed bag, unfortunately. Some echoed Cheselden's observations, others suggested a greater initial visual capacity. The problem was there's so much variation between patients different types of cataracts, ages of surgery, post-operative care.
Makes it hard to compare apples to apples.
Exactly. But the 19th century also saw a broadening of the empirical scope. People started looking at animal and infant development, trying to glean insights from those areas.
Fascinating. So what did they find? Did looking at babies and animals help solve the puzzle?
Well, it added more fuel to the fire, that's for sure. The fact that some animals, like chicks, seem to have an innate understanding of depth perception led some to argue for a more innate basis for visual abilities.
Like they're born with certain visual knowledge already programmed in?
Right. This challenged Berkeley's emphasis on learning as the primary driver of visual perception.
But surely there were opposing views,
Of
right?
course. Others looked at the seemingly uncoordinated visual behavior of human infants and compared it to the experiences of newly sighted individuals. They argued that both suggest a need for learning, supporting a negative answer to Molyneux's question.
So even observing babies didn't provide a clear-cut answer.
Nope. But then came Wheatstone's discovery of binocular disparity, the fact that our two eyes see slightly different images, which our brain uses to create a sense of depth.
Right, that's how 3D movies work.
Exactly. And this was seen as evidence for a more innate visual ability. If we can perceive depth immediately, without any learning, maybe other visual skills are also hardwired.
So by the end of the 19th century, more data, more perspectives, but still no definitive answer to Molyneux's problem. It had become entangled with this broader debate about nature versus nurture in perception.
Precisely. Molyneux's question became a sort of litmus test for how much of our visual experience is innate versus learned.
Okay, so bring us into the modern era, the 20th and 21st centuries. What's the state of the debate today?
Well, in the 20th century, there was a shift towards more historical analysis. Scholars started digging deep into the philosophical arguments from previous centuries, trying to really understand the nuances and context.
Like going back to the source material and analyzing it in a new light.
Exactly. Dugener's work was a major contribution here, providing a really comprehensive historical overview. And Riskin placed Molyneux's problem within the broader intellectual landscape of the Enlightenment, which was all about reason and empirical observation.
Fascinating. So a deeper understanding of the history of the debate itself. But were there any new attempts to actually answer the question empirically?
There were, but they faced challenges. Studies continued to look at individuals recovering from early blindness. But as we've discussed, those cases are complex and hard to interpret. It's tough to isolate a truly first visual experience in humans.
Right. Ethically and practically, it's difficult to create a perfect Molyneux scenario.
Exactly. So researchers turned to other approaches. One was visual deprivation experiments on animals.
So basically, raising animals in darkness and then seeing how their vision develops when exposed to light.
Right. And while it's not a perfect analogy to Molyneux's problem because you're dealing with a developing visual system, not one that suddenly activated these studies, did provide insights into critical periods for visual development, supporting Locke's view that visual experience is crucial for learning how to see.
Right. The idea that there are certain windows of time when the brain is primed to learn specific visual skills.
Exactly. Then there's the work with sensory substitution devices.
Those are fascinating, like the ones that translate visual information into tactile or auditory signals.
Yep. And the logic here is, if you have to learn to interpret visual information presented through a different sense, it suggests that the brain doesn't automatically understand visual input in the same way it understands touch, for example. So it supports a negative answer to Molyneux's question.
Clever way to approach it.
It is, though again, it's not a perfect replication of the original problem. But then, in the 21st century, we see the emergence of Project Prakash in India.
Now this one seems like the closest we've gotten to a real-life test of Molyneux's question.
It really is. Project Prakash provides sight-restoring surgery to children with treatable forms of congenital blindness. It's a truly incredible initiative.
And because these children have never experienced sight before, it creates a unique opportunity to observe their initial visual experiences.
Precisely. And what they found is fascinating. Right after gaining sight, the children could visually distinguish between objects, even showing some ability to grasp them. But when asked to identify an object they were familiar with by touch, just by looking at it.
Like, could they match a toy they'd held to its visual counterpart?
Exactly. Their success rate was barely above chance, meaning they could see, but they couldn't immediately connect what they were seeing to what they knew through touch.
Sounds like a pretty solid no to Molyneux's original question.
It does lend strong support to that conclusion. It seems the initial mapping between vision and touch, at least for object recognition, isn't automatic.
But here's the kicker. They also found that this mapping developed incredibly quickly, often within days.
Yes, it highlights the amazing plasticity of the brain. While that initial connection might not be there, the brain is incredibly efficient at learning and integrating new sensory information.
So we're not born with that connection, but we can build it rapidly.
Precisely. And this has led many to view Molyneux's problem not as a single simple question with a yes or no answer, but as a cluster of related questions about how different senses interact and how we learn to perceive the world.
And there's been some recent criticism of the problem itself, right?
Oh, absolutely. A collection edited by Ferretti and Glenny takes a critical look at the problem, pointing out some of its inherent biases and limitations. For example, they highlight a potential overemphasis on vision in the framing of the problem and the lack of specificity in certain details.
So not only are we refining our understanding of the answer, we're also rethinking the question itself.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even a seemingly simple thought experiment can have layers of complexity.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. We've journeyed through centuries of philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience, all sparked by a question posed over 300 years ago.
And still relevant today.
Absolutely. It really highlights how intricate our senses are and how much we still have to learn about how we perceive the world.
And how intertwined our senses truly are.
So here's a final thought for you listeners. Given what we've learned from Project Prakash and all the philosophical debate, what does this initial difficulty in connecting sight and touch tell us about how we construct our understanding of the world? Is our perception as unified as we intuitively believe, or is it more like a tapestry woven from different sensory threads?
Something to ponder as you go about your day, experiencing the world through your own senses.
As always, thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Until then.